Hello, I'm back with my next episode. I wasn't going to do one on the wrestling games for Nintendo 64. Still going to do that, but something came up that I was going to do a little what I bought this week on, but decided I'm going to do a full episode on it again. And that would be my recent purchase, a Atari 7800. Back in the day, my first video game system ever was actually an Atari XE. And that was actually my intro into video games, you know, Asteroids, Missile Command, all the famous Atari games. And, of course, later on got into Nintendo and all those things, and I wanted to get some of those games back again. And the reason why I bought 7800 is because they play 7800 games and the 2600 games, which is pretty much all the ones that you think of when you think of Atari, you know, Missile Command, Asteroids, Space Invaders, Breakout, and all that. And I haven't actually got a chance to play this one yet because it uses a proprietary power cord that I had to order, which I just received notice is on the way. But what I thought was interesting was a couple of things. You know, looking for hookups, if you remember Ataris, require an RF adapter, the big clunky switch box, and all the extra connections that go in with that, especially hooking it up to a newer TV. It's a little difficult sometimes. And I actually found this little doodad, which instead of dealing with an RF adapter, you just take a regular RCA connector, plug it in on this end, hooks up to the cable on your TV, and then you can plug it right into your Atari since it uses just a regular RCA connection on it. And no fuss, no muss, and it actually gives you a better picture than those old clunky boxy RF adapters that after a while would just not work anymore. Now, the one that I got, the 7800, didn't come with any controllers, which is actually not as big of a problem as you might think for a game system. And the reason why is because Atari, in their infinite wisdom, all their game systems used the same connector, which is regular 9-pin connection. So I still have my old joysticks. These are like the ones that came with the 2600. This one actually came with my Atari XE, but they're the same old Atari sticks that you think of, Atari controllers. Those work fine. The controller that actually came with the 7800 was pretty much the worst controller ever. It looked kind of like this. This is actually from the Atari Flashback unit. It's a little smaller than the original, but it's the same concept with the joystick. You actually had to hold it with this hand and work it like this, and the buttons, and it's just not the best control. They tried something new, didn't really work. Atari was really known for its controller design. They had some really out there models. But one thing that some people know, and not everybody knows, is that not only do all Atari controllers have the same connection, they also share connection with the Sega Genesis. And any Sega gamepad also has the same connection. I'll grab both of them here. As you can see here, they're both the same connection. Now, of course, Sega has 3, or this one has 6 buttons, but only 1 or 2 are going to work depending on which kind of game you're playing. But the control pad is a lot better than anything Atari ever made. So, in a pinch, Sega controllers will work. I actually ordered a pair of the paddle controllers because if you're playing some of the games or racing games, things like that, the paddle controllers are actually really good. Probably the best controllers that Atari made. So if you pick those up pretty cheap, I got mine on eBay for like $12, $13. If you're going to get into Atari games, it's certainly worth the effort to track them down. Now, as far as the 7800 goes, some of you may know that it was originally intended to be released in 1984. It didn't come out until 2 years later. And if you know your video game history, you might remember that 1983 is when the video game industry kind of went down the toilet, the famous crash. A lot of people like to blame this guy, Atari's 2600 version of E.T., which, yeah, it's a bad game, but being a bad game is not what crashed the entire industry. What crashed the entire video game industry in '83 was Atari making 5-6 million copies of this game after buying the license only 5 weeks prior for like 25 million or some dollars, and just assuming, hey, the movie's a big hit, the game's going to be a big hit. Now, if you think about it, not too many games today sell 5 million copies, let alone 1983. So while, yes, this is not that great of a game, it's not the reason why this game being bad is not what crashed the industry. It's Atari way overshooting the popularity of a video game tie-in to a movie would be. I mean, think about it. Even today, you see a video game tie into a movie, which your first thought, well, that's going to be a bad game, it's just a cash-in. It really wasn't any different. Just a bad movie game, just like you see millions of now. Except, you don't see 6 million copies of today's tie-in games being buried in a desert in New Mexico somewhere. Yeah, you live and learn. Well, I guess Atari really didn't live from that. They kind of, wasn't the final nail in the coffin, but they were clearly not the same again. But, you know, if you track these down, they're $1 or $2. It's worth it just to say you played it. You know, I know the Angry Video Game Nerd has a running gag with this. I think the movie he's making is actually going to center around this game somehow. He's tracking down the burial site or something. But, you know, honestly, I think there's far worse Atari games. It's certainly not great, but it's not as bad as people think. Considering it was only made in 5 weeks, it's probably the best made game that only had 5 weeks of development time that you'll ever play. So there's that. But yeah, if you're looking to get the real old school gaming going and you want to buy an Atari, definitely recommend the 7800. You can play the 7800 games, which there aren't that many of. There's about, say, 30 or 40 or so, but they play all the 2600 games, so you have tons of titles you can get. You go to flea markets, you can go on eBay, you can get a lot of bulk lots of Atari games for like $25, $30, and you can get like stacks of them. You know, sometimes shipping, I don't know if some of the things that people charge for shipping on eBay are legit. I mean, you know, cartridges are light. Even a box of 20 of them is going to be practically nothing, and they'll charge $20 to ship cartridges. But yeah, that's why there's flea markets, and there's some game stores, some used stores have Atari games, secondhand stores, you know, Goodwill, you know, Salvation Army kind of places usually have them. People are always selling old Atari stuff. You know, trying to think of it now as you know, an also-ran, but back in the day, I mean, everybody in the world had an Atari. I remember growing up, my aunt, who was probably the as far opposite of a game player as you could ever imagine, I remember going to their house and playing, I believe, with a 2600, might have been even a 5200, but it was an Atari system, and if she had it, everybody had it. So, and they last. You know, there was no red ring of death for Atari consoles. So if you find one that's been, you know, even relatively well taken care of, it's probably still going to work. You may need to do minor things like, you know, get new power cord or something like that for it, because the 7800 uses its own proprietary connection, which is a pain, because if it breaks or goes, you kind of have to hunt for it. There's a few specialty you know, stores for Atari that can sell you one for like, a genuine Atari one's like $27. I got a third-party one for, I think it was about 12 or 13. But that's really the most effort you have to put into getting a system, and it's Atari. I mean, you can play all those old school games. Yeah, people are saying you can emulate them. 2600 games you can. 7800 emulation, it's not really perfect. There's some flaws in it, and you know, there's really nothing like just taking the cartridge, putting it in the system, powering it up. I mean, that's what we all grew up with. And especially, you know, the games on the 7800, you know, you think of Atari as all, you know, like Pong or Asteroids are really basic graphics, but the 7800 was actually competing with the NES, with the Sega Master System at the time, and the games designed for it are actually not that far off. I mean, the sound's not the same because it had the same sound as the 2600, but graphics-wise, I mean, you put a 7800 game up against a NES game, and it's not always obvious which one's which. So, yeah, definitely worth checking out. You know, you can't go wrong. You know, as long as you find one that's in, you know, relatively good working order, you can use any kind of controllers. Fairly easy to hook up. and they'll last forever. So that's my kind of brief wrap up of the 7800 and a brief history of Atari in the video game world that it lived in. So that's going to be the sign off for now, and that episode I was working on before with the N64 wrestling games still in the works. Should be coming soon. I'm going to wrap it up for now, and I will see you later.